Welcome to the Hawks Health Hacks Podcast, your trusted source for wellness, fitness, and healthy lifestyle insights. We believe in empowering you with knowledge to take control of your health. Join us as we explore the latest in self-care, share expert advice, and guide you on your journey to optimal well-being. Let's embark on this path to a healthier you together.
Hello, and welcome to Hawks Health Hacks, the podcast where we dive deep into the mind-body connection to help you live your healthiest, most vibrant life. I'm your host today, Anita Haque, and I'm thrilled to bring you today's episode, which is extra special because it features my sister, Dr. Anita Haque, a chiropractor who's not only a wellness expert, but someone who's walked the path of overcoming personal struggles with weight and eating challenges. Her journey is one of resilience, self-compassion, and holistic healing, and she's here to share it with you. Joining us is Mark Gibson, a therapist with over 20 years of experience specializing in eating disorders and dialectical behavioral therapy. He's a co-author of It Was Never About the Food, a master at guiding people toward meaningful change through trust and practical strategies. Together, they're tackling anxiety and eating disorders, topics that hit home for so many of us, whether you're an athlete chasing peak performance, someone navigating body image challenges, or just looking for ways to manage stress and feel your best. From Anita's chiropractic insights and personal story to Mark's therapeutic expertise, this episode is packed with real talk, actionable hacks, and a whole lot of hope. So grab a drink, settle in, and let's get ready to hack our health with Hawks Health Hacks. Here we go. So, Anita, you've openly shared your lifelong struggles with weight and eating issues, which many listeners can relate to. Can you share a little more about it and also a pivotal moment in your journey that helped you shift towards a healthy relationship with food and your body?
Yeah, definitely. I have to start off by saying that this is probably the most important thing in my life, the weight that set me on this course of my healing journey and bringing it to others. So I was 7 years old when I remember our mom, Sima, sitting me down alone, and she, as compassionately at the time, I'm sure, as she could have said to me, she sat me down and said, okay, I think you're putting on some weight. We need to dial back. She said it a little differently, but basically we need to dial back on your eating. So you can't get a second serving. You're going to have to cut back on some of the desserts and the sweet treats that your sisters get to eat. So at first I was a bit shocked, like, she's talking to me? Like, what, me? I have a weight issue? I don't even know if I was aware, and I did a lot of denial. I remember saying repetitively, I'm not overweight. I'm just big boned. I'm just maybe chubby, maybe making it kind of cute at the time for myself to cope and to deal. But at 7 years old, how do you really know how it affects you until time moves forward and you get to reflect? So for me, I started an unhealthy relationship with food at that time because I wasn't really aware what she meant and how she meant it, but I knew, oh, I got to cut back. So there was a lot of starvation, and some of it happened because of the way that my lunches were put. So for example, my lunch at that time went from like a sandwich and, a juice box and a piece of fruit to just the juice box and the piece of fruit. And so I would at lunch be embarrassed because, everybody would pull out their lunch from their brown bag and I only had my juice box and maybe an apple. And a lot of my friends were like, where's your lunch? Where's your sandwich? And I wasn't forthcoming about, well, I'm on a diet. I can't eat a sandwich. I'm cutting back. But what I did end up doing was, making an excuse that I wasn't hungry because I didn't want anybody to know about it. And when I came home and our parents, Simon, weren't home because they were at work, I ate snacks, unhealthy snacks, all the junk food that was like available because I was starving. And so I would eat and eat all these unhealthy things. And then when mom and dad came home for dinner, I would eat dinner as well, even though I wasn't necessarily hungry for it from all those junk food items that I had consumed. So it was just this perpetual cycle at my youth that I knew I was aware of something that wasn't right. I didn't have the perfection, for my mom's eyes of where I needed to be, but it made me more aware of food, dieting, my self-esteem, the body awareness. And it definitely led me into this pathway of trying to bring it to other people, because I too am still a lifelong student. So you asked me another question, which I think is important for our listeners to hear, which is, what was a pivotal moment that may have shifted my relationship, with food and my body? I don't know if there was actually one specific moment, but it was later on in life, probably in my later 30s, that I realized that all these different diets that I've tried, and I've tried every single one that most people have heard of, from the master cleanse, the starvation, from Dr. Atkins to, cutting out the carbs, if we're talking paleo, there's so many diets that I've absolutely tried. But what was a pivotal thing for me was realizing that I don't need to become skinny. I don't need to get skinny. I just need to become healthier. That was one of my pivotal moments for sure. And understanding that my goal is not about the vanity. It was more about the inside and how my functioning of my body. So that was one pivotal moment. And the second pivotal moment was, I don't need to deprive myself, because the more that I was in some sort of a box of a diet, some sort of like guideline, I ended up doing worse. I ended up maybe sabotaging myself more because I felt restricted. And many of you who are listening to this podcast may agree or have had some sense of that restriction that makes you want to rebel, and eat more of the things that you're not supposed to eat. So that was another pivotal moment for me, was realizing that I no longer need to practice perfectionism with my diet, because there's no such thing, but I only want to strive for eating nourishing foods. At least 70 to 80% of what I want to eat on a day should be something healthy and nourishing for my body. And then I got to live a little and not be in the box and splurge and maybe have that chocolate or have that ice cream bar or whatever my craving is for that day. So those were kind of my pivotal moments of the shift.
Well, that's amazing. And you look amazing. Poor mom, if she watches this, she's going to now know why her diet never worked for you. All that after hacking.
And it's not her fault. So I want them to know this. She did the best she could. She had the best intention. There's no blame or no hang up on that, of course.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Mark, your book, It Was Never About the Food, suggests eating disorders are rooted in deeper emotional or psychological issues. How do you help clients, including those with experiences like Dr. Haque, with people struggling with weight and eating, and how do you uncover and address any of these underlying causes?
Well, if we start with the beginning, if I talk about the depth of eating disorders, I specialize, more of my work has been done with anorexia and bulimia, meaning being underweight, or a lot of people with bulimia struggle with what they call compensatory behaviors, which is compensating for calories taken in, like purging, over exercising, diet pills. So I've spent a lot of time at higher levels of care, inpatient, where people are oftentimes bedridden for a while. So I wanted to just kind of capture that beginning part first, because we have this on the spectrum of where treatment can be. And when it's on that end of the spectrum, it is a lot of stabilization at the beginning. I have people that oftentimes come in and their heart rates are extremely low, or they haven't had a menstrual cycle for a year. And so it requires, if I've had some people that come in where I had to send them to Stanford right away. And when you go to Stanford, you go to a bed until your vitals are stabilized and you do not move. And so I have that end of the spectrum. And then what a lot of times what we're talking about here has to do with kind of developing a healthy relationship with food overall, like kind of combating dieting concepts and mentalities. And with them, to be honest, in my career, I think I've been horrible at that treatment because people don't stick with me long term, because my focus is about more intuitive eating, which is kind of what you're hinting at, Anita, is throughout your lifetime having this diet, and then you realize, wow, I'm still hungry. So we still have that primitive part of our brain that's saying I need more food. And so we're battling that with messages of body image, judgment that come from society. And so it gets to be extremely confusing, but I'm trying to now teach this intuitive eating process, and it flies in the face, I think, a lot of what is norm in our society, which is fast acting, quick weight loss, and it just doesn't sustain. And so I start talking about intuitive eating, which is connected to mindfulness and honoring hunger and fullness. And most people are looking for a quick change, and I end up kind of struggling with them. But if I talk about the initial phase of stabilization, it's amazing what starts to happen, which is I move to that next phase, which I kind of call figuring it out. And when people get stabilized and they're nourished and they're feeling good and they start to participate in life, is when that underlying aspects of what might be at the core of an eating disorder starts to come to the surface. And that's where the long-term work is. And that can be, I've seen people since I started in this field, there are some people that I still see on a maintenance kind of basis. So, it's quite a wild ride and into those spectrums that I was talking about.
I'm sure it's great to have your support.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Haque. So. Yes, definitely. How did your personal experiences with weight influence your approach to helping patients at Haque Chiropractic with nutrition and wellness?
I think it's a huge integral part of the way that I practice, the way I speak to patients, not just because of my own personal experience, but because I also now really understand the value of how food is medicine, or it could be poison, on the other end of the spectrum. But in the sense of even with their treatments and getting repair with their chiropractic care, their nutrition and how much inflammatory foods or what they're feeding themselves is going to impact the results that they're also going to receive from not only their adjustments, but holding their adjustments, seeing the improvement, having the inflammation come down. There's so much in our diet that impacts that. So that is definitely something that's at the forefront. But beyond that, for me, my personal experience in terms of even Mark, what you were bringing up, you have, the anorexia and the bulimia. I think I've had all of those things. And so I feel comfortable opening up to patients and sharing that with them, making sure that they know it's a safe place for them to know that, there is no perfectionism here, that we're all dealing with our emotions. And sometimes the way that we deal with our emotions is feeding our emotions with food or a substance or something like in that realm. And I'm, being aware of that allows me to kind of ask maybe certain questions so that patients can feel more comfortable to share that with me and open up that conversation. So that allows me to maybe give them some more direction, whether they need to speak to somebody maybe more severely, like talking to Mark, maybe us just having a conversation about, hey, when you're stressed, you went to doing, this activity, which was, eating that junk food. I resonate. I did that same thing. Here's what else you can do instead. So having that conversation, because I really feel that part of the care that every single patient gets in my office is not just the adjustment, but it's the experience of uplifting their health, maybe making that little bit of a pivot, a change besides the adjustment that can maybe set them on a better course for health.
It totally makes sense. Mark, you've worked with eating disorders across inpatient and outpatient settings for 20 years. What's a common misconception about eating disorders that you'd like to debunk for our listeners?
I know when I saw that question earlier, there's the initial that if I just speak just on observation, if I tell people what I do, their initial response is, I have an eating disorder. Do you think you can help me? And they point at their belly. And I say that because I mean, just at that point, I just kind of will smirk a little bit and say, like, yeah, I mean, I can very much appreciate that side of the struggle that people have. And then I will take that opportunity oftentimes to educate people that the other end of this, I mean, I think in the long term, in the long run, you're talking about obesity is definitely not going to be able to be sustainable for a healthy lifestyle and lifespan. But in terms of the anorexia and bulimia, it's in the mental health world, it's one of the most deadliest mental health diseases that there is. And so I think that's one of the things that sometimes will catch people's attention. The other thing that I highlight that oftentimes surprises people, and this is like working with like family groups over my career, is struggling to recognize the function of an eating disorder in people's lives. So the idea that when somebody might purge or restrict or starve themselves to the point that they need to be in a hospital, most people are thinking like, at what point is kind of the rational mind going to kick in and you're just going to eat? Or how could people enjoy throwing up? And they struggle to recognize that there is a function to that. So the idea with anorexia, oftentimes it reduces the ability to recognize things going on in the world around them. So for anxiety, when you are malnourished, you don't have the same level of anxiety. It goes down. With bulimia, it's in that moment, it very much is a numbing agent. And if there's intensity going on around, that experience is very soothing in the moment for people. And that's been the one where people just look at me and go like, I just can't wrap my head around it. And so that probably to me is one of the biggest misconceptions of it.
That's great. I never even thought about that. How your malnutrition could impact your psyche like that.
Yeah. It makes sense.
Yeah. Anita, you've described breaking free from negative cycles with the help of your husband, Don, and adopting self-love as part of your health equation. And Mark, you focus on behavioral change through therapy. What are some key steps someone can take to break from the cycles of anxiety or disordered eating? And Mark, maybe you could share first.
Breaking from the cycles of disordered eating or anxiety. Well, let me start with the idea of the cycles. Like if we talk about anxiety, I think it's really important. Most of my education starts there, which is understanding the function of emotions, as opposed to breaking free of anxiety. The function of it is it keeps us alive. So we don't want to break free from it, learning how to regulate it. Or the other side to it, if we think about the other part of anxiety is helping us to prepare. So if I am doing this podcast, guess what some of the anxiety leading up to it did for me? Mm-hmm. I started doing some research, looking through questions. I've done a lot of moving around lately, so I haven't spent a lot of time doing presentations. So I'm going to go in and utilize some of that anxiety to help me get prepared. And so that's one of the things that is a big focus of mine, is re-educating people to learning to really embrace emotions and utilize them for what they're for. So yeah, that's a big part of this.
That makes sense. And Anita, and yourself, like how did you break free from your negative cycles to adopt like self-love, part of your health journey?
Kind of, I like what you said, Mark, there about how it's not necessarily breaking free, kind of me to my answer here too. So just so the listeners know, my equation that I've come up with for health, or more optimal health, is the following. So optimal health is equal to love to yourself and others. Mm-hmm. So that's a big one. Love and being healthy leads to happiness. So that's kind of the equation. Sorry, I reversed it. So let me start off again. So basically being loving to yourself, being loving to others, and being as healthy as you can be through all the things, right? Your sleep, your eating, your movement, all of those things, thinking healthy. That's really what leads to optimal like joy and happiness in my life. And that's kind of the equation that I put out, through the books I've written and things like that, or even for patients. So, in terms of, breaking free, it's in the equation. And what's really in the equation in terms of, even though it's not necessarily breaking free, but maybe breaking free from that negative thing you're doing to yourself comes from that part of the equation of self-love. I often have found that through my own self dialect, I'm kinder to others than I am to myself in the past. And I've had to recognize, why am I being so mean to myself? Like, I would never say this to any of you. I would never pick on you on something like that. Why am I doing this to myself? Which was kind of an awareness for me to break some of the cycle of negativity that I was doing to my body, or doing with the purging, or doing with the starving, started becoming kinder to myself, which really is self-love. And that led me into more of, okay, my self-love is, being kinder to myself, but also part of self-love is self-discipline and self-respect. So maybe my self-discipline isn't not necessarily not eating, but it's being disciplined to not purge, to not starve, to not be so harsh on myself. So that's kind of one of the ways that for myself, I feel like it's my behaviors learn to change and shift. So I wasn't going back to those same bad habits that we often tend to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was thinking about the second part of it. You mentioned disordered eating aspect of it. I talked about the emotional side, but the idea of patterns that people fall into, and you were talking about, finding that balance with calories of how they are viewed. I remember early on in my career, I think it very much was, if we're talking about stabilization, the belief a lot of times at different treatment centers that I was a part of was a calorie is just a calorie. And that was the focus on just getting refed. And we didn't care how it happened. And that was oftentimes with people talking about malnourishment with anorexia. And as I think I grew in my career and started talking to different, and maybe it's just a natural part of progression in life when you learn more and you start working with different professionals, is starting to really appreciate the quality of food and how people are gaining weight. Because oftentimes you would find that if the focus early on in stabilization was just about getting weight put on, people oftentimes, when they would leave, would struggle with overeating. And so we started to find more of that balance where, well, a calorie is just not a calorie. And then, Anita, you had kind of highlighted but a calorie can also be celebratory, especially in the short run. So, and oftentimes kind of breaking free from that, I run into people, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of orthorexia, but it's really an obsession that people can develop around healthy foods. And with them, it's another process of breaking free from the idea of like, hey, it's your child's birthday. This is part of the celebration, being present with your child and being able to have cake. Or I run into professionals that can't go out to lunch with other coworkers because they don't know where they're going. They don't know who's preparing their food. And so their world gets very restrictive. And then the idea of breaking free of that cycle is exposure therapy. You got to turn over control to somebody else, trusting that there's going to be something there that's going to fit within a process that's going to serve your body well. And we still might have those times where we have an inkling for some dessert or something even that is part of connecting. Talk about celebration, but just social connections.
You made such a good point. Sorry, I just want to say this part because Mark, I had a younger patient, she's 17, and
Mhm.
she often asks me about her diet when she comes in for her adjustments, and she tracks everything. And I know that there's a lot of people who use these trackers for everything they eat, and they track, all the macronutrients, how much protein, how many calories, how many carbs per meal. She brings me her charts like, Dr. Haque, look, this is what I put together. And I remember saying that kind of what you just touched on, Mark, is, I'm glad that you're making a food journal, you're being aware, but this can also become unhealthy because, the calorie count from an apple, let's say that's 80 calories for a medium-sized apple, is not going to be the same value of 80 calories from, let's say, a candy bar that you might consume.
Mhm.
So you don't want to get so obsessed on the numbers as opposed to the wherewithal, the logic of knowing this is nourishing for me to eat. This is a treat for me to eat. This is
Mhm.
joyful. And then when you eat a treat, the hardest thing I know I've had to overcome too in the past is, okay, if I'm going to have a treat, let's say I'm going to go out to dinner, because you're right, orthorexia could be something that's prominent, maybe even in my life, where I am very focused on healthy eating. But if I'm going to eat something bad and then spend the next 3 hours thinking about, oh my God, I just ate this dessert, and oh, shame on me. You're disciplining yourself internally that I shouldn't have eaten that chocolate cake. I ate so well all day, and then I had that piece of chocolate cake and I ruined my whole diet. Like, people have that hang up. I know I've had that hang up, as opposed to knowing, hey, I'm enjoying this treat of a chocolate cake. I ate healthful foods all day, and now I'm not thinking about it. I'm just going to enjoy it. And doing that, you're not even raising your cortisol necessarily as much on a cellular level, which could hurt you and make you put on more weight from the stuff that you're eating and feeling guilty about. So there's so many like complexities to how we eat and how we count foods that sometimes I feel that when I speak to the patient I was mentioning, toss that away. Stop worrying about all the details. Let's focus on the grander picture here. You want to eat really healthy things and kind of move forward. Yeah.
Well, that kind of speaks sometimes to the intuitive eating too.
Yes.
Um, is Yeah, I think when people are learning to eat, sometimes I've used the number of calories from the standpoint of, hey, let's look at the science now behind what you think you're doing, to highlight how the relationship to it is so misinformed that when they actually find out how much they're eating and it's not anywhere near what their body actually needs, sometimes I find out they're not even getting what their brain would consume in a normal day. And so it can be utilized to help debunk some philosophies they might have. And then on the other end, I'm like, well, you know, if you were a Olympic athlete like Michael Phelps, it's important to know how many calories are going to your body because you're trying to perform at this elite level. And but in general, what you kind of find is most people, is I'm back to having that discussion as much as I can when they get stabilized, of your body and your mind, if you're connected to it, will let you know what it needs. If you get really in tune with it, it actually can start to let you know what kinds of food it's asking for. So like the idea of carbs, you're talking about like the Atkins diet. Like, well, that cut out really efficient or necessary carbs that give our body energy. That when people do that, they end up then at some point running out of energy. And then what do? It's
Yeah. They
your
eat the
body's asking for energy. So what are you gonna start to crave? And so, but I'm just like, I'd rather it not get to the point where your body's without it before it kicks in, where we start to connect to it on a day-to-day basis.
That makes sense.
I just wanted to move over into what Mark kind of specializes in, which is the dialectical behavioral therapy. I
Mm-hmm.
want to understand how individuals with maybe anxiety and eating disorder symptoms, like an athlete, how it can help them with, managing the pressure of weight struggles, or how to manage their, eating habits. So what does dialectical behavioral therapy do for
Well,
athletes?
if I break it down, a dialect, if I define that for people first, um, is the idea as human beings, we have the capacity to experience two opposing thoughts or emotions at the same time. Dialectical behavior therapy stands on the relationship between acceptance and change. At their core, they're very opposite, but there's a paradoxical relationship between the two of them. And that is, if you haven't accepted what's happening or where you're at, the idea of doing change doesn't happen. So oftentimes people end up fighting against themselves that anxiety has shown up, or I have this intensity going on, and it prevents them from actually doing something about it. So it's just like DBT is such this bigger picture concept from a behavioral standpoint, but it's broken down into 4 modules. And there's 2 acceptance-based modules and 2 change-based modules. And the acceptance-based is mindfulness and distress tolerance. And so the change ones have to do with emotion regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. And that's where you're working on improving relationships. I talked about anxiety earlier, the idea of utilizing anxiety. Some people, the anxiety shows up and they're so frustrated with themselves that, somebody told me not to worry anymore. However, here I am worrying. What do I now do? And if I am stuck with the idea that there's something wrong with me that I'm worrying, it's tough to go to the regulatory process, which is, I got to do something with this. Is it justified or not? And then I can start utilizing it. Now, in the sports world, if we're talking about not just sports, but for performance in general, I find myself utilizing mindfulness as the foundation of people's work. And that is really tuning in to the idea of what is happening to me internally with my thoughts, with my body. And I don't know, if you look at the research and the years in which people spend practicing mindfulness, I've done, in the stuff that I've read, they've talked about the idea of 20 minutes a day of practicing mindfulness. And that is, there is like meditation and then there's mindfulness. We hear about meditation from this idea of this soothing, calming kind of experience. Mindfulness, at its core, I try and get people, you sit with yourself and your brain. You remove other distractions, and you're learning to work and understand what is happening inside of you. And for some people, that is very scary and very uncomfortable. And hence why I say, go do that work. Because if you want to learn how to regulate emotions or perform at a really high level, you gotta learn to be aware of what's happening in the moment in order to work with it.
Well, that's one of the next questions I was going to ask you, actually, was if you could share like a specific, therapy skill so listeners could, practice or resonate with if they are overwhelmed by anxiety or food triggers.
I kind of jumped ahead with it, but yes, mindfulness for sure is that. But it's one of those things that I wouldn't call it a specific skill, as opposed to a practice that helps to improve and shape your brain so you are ready for things like difficult emotions that come your way or pressure that comes your way. However, if I'll just dip down for a second to the idea of I think a lot of times people can really resonate with intense anxiety, or if I'm having, I'm getting dressed in the morning and here I am looking myself in the mirror and I can't see myself leaving the house because I'm so overwhelmed by my body image right now. I have found, this is just in the years that I've been working in the field and teaching DBT, there's a skill that they call, it's kind of, Anita, you would know about this, like working with cold therapy, but cold immersion. Mm-hmm. But you can almost do it with just your head and just holding your breath and putting your face into cold water has an amazing ability of it drops your heart rate, which
shocks your body kind of.
It's called like a dive reflex. Mm-hmm. And so when that happens, oftentimes so you have such this contrast of this intensity going on, then all of a sudden your body, like heart rate, blood pressure, all that stuff kind of dumps real quick. And it provides sometimes that space for people to tune in a little bit more to more of their rational or wise mind, where if I'm having this experience, sometimes people are like, it's almost like delusional what they think what they're seeing like in the mirror at times. And if the intensity is high, that can really help bring it down rather quickly, especially like with panic attacks or those kind of things. Like it's a game changer. Usually people will come back after that and go, wow, like that one hits home quick. Almost to the point where I tell people that if they actually have lower heart rates already, do it sitting down, because it can have that much of an impact, because it can almost like create where people might pass out.
Well, that's a quick fix.
It is as quick as it gets.
Just wanted to end the podcast with a health hack from both of you, if possible. I just wanted to find out from maybe Anita first. That's somebody who's overcome personal challenges with weight. And Mark, yourself as a therapist who you support so many people in recovery, what's a health hack you can offer to our listeners who feel stuck in their struggles with anxiety, eating, or body image? And maybe Fida, you could share first. That'd be great.
Yeah, I had to do a few things, and this is the hack that I would like to share that I've lived and I still use at times. One is I like to take a deep breath before I eat. It's just a quick hack, kind of like resetting. Sometimes for anxiety purposes, you're not breathing enough. Number one, you're doing a shallow breathing situation, so you're not even as logical because of that. So sometimes, just taking a moment, full inhale, full exhale, can help me to kind of get more rational, calm down my nerves. And especially before I eat, it starts to focus me a little bit more on, let's enjoy this meal. Because one of the things I used to do when I was anxious or I was eating, not because I was trying to nourish my body, but I was trying to feed an emotion or settle down a negative emotion in my body, is I would eat in a numb form. So meaning eating without thinking about it, eating while I'm watching a screen, on a phone call, I'm doing something else. So I'm not focused on actually nourishing myself. I'm kind of, doing this in the past. So that was a big thing for me to recognize that pattern. And in order for me to recognize that pattern, it helps me now is to take that deep breath before I eat to make sure, okay, let me make sure I'm calm here. Two, what am I feeling right now before I eat? Asking myself that question. Am I really hungry? Or am I just feeling scared, upset, angry, anxious, all of those feelings? Do I need to recognize that first? So sometimes taking that deep breath allows me to ask that question of, am I really hungry, or am I just feeding something else? So that was another way that I remember having to break myself maybe out of the pattern. The other thing that led into, kind of this hack is I made mistakes all the time. I still do, even with eating. So I have to often remind myself, forgive me. Like, forgive myself for maybe not being perfect. Forgive myself for maybe doing what I said I wasn't going to do, because I'm human, just like I would forgive someone else, right? I mentioned that earlier about, treating yourself like you would treat somebody else. So forgiveness is a big part of that hack for me, of knowing that I'm not going to be perfect and I don't need to be perfect, because there's no such thing. But am I progressing? Am I getting just a little bit better than I was? And forgiveness is a part of that. Forgiving myself for maybe having something I said I wouldn't eat, or, like I said, having the extra treat, but enjoying it more so with that forgiveness. And I already mentioned this to you both, treating yourself like a friend kind of goes into that self-love. So I think that those are my main hacks, is taking that deep breath, taking a moment, asking yourself if you're really hungry for this. Sometimes you need to just sort of take that numbness out of what we always do as a pattern.
I love that. Taking the time to pause.
Yes.
And know yourself. What about for you, Mark? You have
the word that when I was reading the question, the thing that jumped out was the word stuck. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle. I love what you said, Anita, about some of the more in the moment work. I thought about it attaching it from the angle of, I use the word transparency. And in order to get unstuck, I think a lot of times people over time get very stuck in their lives because their struggles are more internal and inward, and they hide. And oftentimes because they feel ashamed or feel embarrassed or guilty or just anxious and stuck. And the idea of, and it just what we put down with anxiety, eating, body image, it thrives in secrecy, because oftentimes we end up feeling like, but understandable though, it's understandable how people get there, because it's uncomfortable, and you end up, if you protect it more when nobody else knows about it. And so the idea of getting unstuck, just being transparent, and that can be as simple as opening up to your chiropractor, opening up to your primary doctor, a family member. Not oftentimes do I get the initial call from somebody that this is their time to be transparent. It's usually somebody else has said to them, you need more help, and we got to get this ball rolling. But it will happen oftentimes with anorexia and bulimia because of health issues, and they can't hide that anymore. And so that becomes the obvious thing going on. But in general, if we can learn to be more transparent, we can get proactive in some of these changes that go on. So I kind of think of that seems to be the one that jumped out to me the most, is just the idea of being transparent and not hiding.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Just recognition for yourself too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You guys both have shared wonderful hacks with the listeners. And I'm not sure if, Anita, you wanted to end off with anything for our listeners today.
Definitely. I just want to say, Mark, you are such a great resource. We're so happy to have you on today on this podcast, and we'll share your information with listeners if they want to get in touch with you to maybe get some more therapy, some assistance, because I think that, like you mentioned, your hack kind of being more transparent. That's why we're having this discussion. I want all of us to be able to have more of a normalcy around this topic, because it is a lot in secret, and it was a lot in secret for me too, until you kind of can admit it and know that, hey, I'm not alone. So many of us are dealing with this on different levels. But the more we share, the more we can kind of say, okay, I'm not alone in this. You're like me. I'm feeling the same way. We can kind of be there for each other and hopefully get on a healthier pathway. So thank you both so much for today and for sharing your insights. It means a lot.
Well, I appreciate the invite. Like I said, I have been in my recent moves, I've been staring at the screen, just doing my day-to-day grind of work. So getting to spread out and connect with other professionals in a different way, and doing presenting and having that kind of thing has been a nice little change to my getting more settled into this new area. So
well, awesome. We're happy to have you. Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Haque's Health Hacks podcast. We hope today's discussion has provided valuable insights into achieving and maintaining your health. Remember, your well-being is our priority. Visit us at haquechiropractic.com or call 925-960-1960 to learn more or schedule an appointment.